I'm going to start. I don't know if they can hear me down the back. All right. Okay, so in this session, I'll be sort of continuing on what we talked about yesterday. So we gave a bit of a background to some of the approaches you can take to try to mitigate climate change, as well as sort of the economic approach to climate change and why we need policies involved. So today's talk is very much going to be around examples of climate policy. So we'll look at sort of theoretical examples as well as real life examples in different countries, with a particular focus on emissions trading schemes and sort of cap and trade schemes. Okay, just some ground rules. Again, I'll introduce myself. So I'm Dominic White and I'm a postdoc associate at the Centre for Sustainability Science and Strategy. Again, there might be some jargon that we use here that if I don't explain it properly, please interrupt and I'll try and re-explain what it means, or think of a different way of describing it. But just keep the questions light while I'm talking, and then if you have a sort of deeper questions, you can ask it at the end. There will be some time for questions. And again, we're not spokespeople for the Centre for Sustainability Science and Strategy, MIT, or any of the sponsors, and our remarks and opinions are entirely personal. Okay, so I gave you an introduction to sort of how we think about climate change from an economics perspective yesterday. And now I'm going to go over some of the different policies that can be introduced to try and mitigate that externality that I talked about. So the first here is the idea of regulation policies. And so this is the idea of regulating emissions by mandating specific quantities or performance levels. So I'm sure you would have heard of it, sort of like fuel efficiency standards, that kind of thing. That is a regulation. Okay? And it's quite a major part of environmental policy. So some of the examples include the corporate average fuel economy, which says that for automobile makers, they have to have some sort of fuel standard across their range, and of course it changes in different regions. There's the renewable portfolio standard, which says for energy companies, they must have some proportion of renewable energy, and that proportion is going up over time. Another is the renewable fuels standard, which says for the transport fleet there must be an increasing amount of sustainable fuels included in that fleet. And the clean power plant standard plan, which basically says, okay, well, we've got these power plants, let's try and make them a bit more renewable and a bit more sustainable. So that's the idea behind a regulation. So they're very sort of broad. They cover a lot of different industries. And sort of an advantage here is it prompts investment in new technology because there's an incentive now to move towards renewable or sustainable fuels or technologies. Now the drawback is that it's quite inefficient because again it's a very blanket policy. It's sort of indirectly targeting what the issue is, which is emissions. And the burden is unequal for different producers because you're introducing a policy, some companies have different environmental performances than others, and it's kind of hard to work out, working from a baseline, it's hard to have a regulation that's not unfair on certain producers and on certain consumers as well. And it also requires viable enforcement mechanisms. It's all good to say, okay, let's hit this renewable standard, but what's actually in place if those companies don't meet those standards? How do you sort of enforce that rule? So another option that we have is something called a carbon tax. I'm sure you would have heard about it in the media. It often gets quite bad press because taxes often do get quite bad press. But the economic approach for externalities and to reach sort of market efficiency is to try and tax bad things and to subsidize good things. Okay, so a tax is just an additional cost that you pay, usually as a producer, sometimes as a consumer, on various goods to try and get it to sort of the optimal equilibrium point. And so the price or cost of greenhouse gas emissions is included in this carbon tax, and then it gets incorporated into the price of the goods or services. So for every unit of greenhouse gas emissions released, the emitter pays for the social cost of these emissions. So you should remember this graph from yesterday when I was talking about externalities. This is a negative producer externality. If we don't have any policy in place, we're operating in an equilibrium of P star and Q star. That is not the socially optimal point. okay, because this coal electricity power plant is emitting carbon dioxide that's affecting people, and so the marginal social cost is higher than what the private cost is. And to get to that social cost, you introduce a tax, which is the size between that P star point and P0. Okay, and so that tax is incorporating the cost that is associated with emitting carbon dioxide emissions. Okay, so that looks great on paper, and you're now incorporating that externality. We're at a socially optimal point. But there are a few questions that need to be answered when you're thinking about introducing a carbon tax. So first of all, what are the actual costs of climate change, right? What is that marginal social cost? Because we know what the private cost is, because that's just the cost of labour, cost of intermediate inputs, land, etc. But what the actual cost of that emissions on society is very hard to calculate, okay? Because there's many different things that are going on when climate change is being thought about. There's also the question of what's the socially optimal amount of pollution, because if you've got an economy working, it's not feasible to have zero emissions. You've got to have some emissions for us to exist. And so what is the socially optimal amount of pollution, and who makes that decision? Who's responsible for the pollution? So are we going to charge it to producers, or are we going to charge it to consumers, or both? And again, how much do we tax, which is very much linked to what is the socially optimal amount of pollution and what are the costs? And also, who will be impacted? Okay, so you can introduce a carbon tax, but it might unfairly impact lower income households compared to higher income households. And again, that's not fair. That's just sort of causing a more unequal society and could cause even more issues down the line. So there are important questions to be asked. So another alternative is an idea of a cap and trade scheme. Okay, so it's essentially equivalent to a carbon tax, but in this case you have a government that sets a quantity of emissions that it wants to hit each year, and usually that quantity of emissions goes down over time. Okay, and the way they do this is they allocate permits to companies for their right to emit. Okay, so the government says, okay, for every tonne of carbon dioxide that gets emitted, you need to have a permit to do that. Okay, and so when they emit, they submit that permit back to the government, and they're not allowed to reuse that permit. Okay, and it's a year-by-year basis. Now what happens is you end up having companies that get more efficient. Okay, so they get given these permits, and they think, well, we're not going to use all of these because we're not emitting as much as we did last year, and so they can sell those permits to other companies that are emitting way too much. Okay, and so right there you have a price for carbon, and it's purely between this interaction between firms that are efficient and firms that are inefficient. Okay, so it's the same as a carbon tax in the sense that okay, you've got a price for carbon now, but it's much more of sort of a interaction between the government and firms. And the way that the price goes up over time is that the government reduces the amount of permits it gives out each year, which increases the scarcity of those permits and therefore increases the price. So thinking about these two options, so from different sort of levels, we've got a carbon tax. We are setting a fixed cost per unit, and that cost can change in different years, but you have uncertainty in the emissions. And then you have a cap and trade approach where you fix the emissions based on the amount of permits you give out, but you have uncertainty in costs. They can be equivalent to each other if the tax rate is associated with the emissions cap. But it's very hard to try and get those two things to match up. And you can see on the graph over here, we're looking at the carbon tax versus the cap and trade scheme. You have emissions abatement on the x-axis, and you have price on the y-axis. And you can see that the cap and trade scheme is targeting the emissions abatement. So that's what that vertical orange line is, dotted line. And the carbon tax is targeting the price. And so that's what that horizontal blue line is there. Now, an issue with this is they're all market policies. Okay, so it's again great to think about this in terms of demand and supply curves on a piece of paper, and you say, okay, this is how people are going to react. But the problem is markets are complex societal constructs, and sometimes things don't quite work out as you'd expect on paper, and economic efficiency doesn't always get achieved when you're introducing these kinds of policies. So another option is an idea of subsidies, and that's essentially just making clean options more attractive than polluting ones by reducing their costs. So the government is coming along and saying, okay, you know, we want to tax bad things, let's give some money to try and reduce the costs involved with clean technologies. So there's a few different ways of introducing a subsidy. One is lower investment costs, so that's by giving things like grants or tax credits, also rebates where they pay back a certain cost to different producers. They can reduce operating costs by including things like a feed-in tariff, where they guarantee that they'll get a price for a certain good that's over the market value, and the government makes up that difference. You can have contracts for difference, which essentially says, okay, as a government, we'll wear the risk of this technology costing a lot now, assuming it's going to be cheaper in the future, and sort of making up that difference. And you also have support innovation, which includes research and development funding, pilot and demonstration projects that get funded by the government. And so the idea here is to sort of correct market failures and make sure that there's clean options available. But the problem is, so clean technologies often face high upfront costs, and this tries to get rid of that. And climate benefits are not fully reflected in market prices. Again, this tries to mitigate sort of the externalities that we're dealing with in the market. And another benefit is it can accelerate deployment. So as long as the subsidies are correctly placed, you have incentives in place to help scale up those renewables. So think about electric vehicles. There's a lot of rebates around the world for electric vehicles. And the idea is that as more and more of this technology is produced, the cost will come down over time, and these subsidies will have to come down as well. So it gets cheaper and cheaper to do. Okay, I'm going to quickly hand over to Lucas. And he'll give you a few slides on assessing these different policies.
Yep. So with these different policies Dom just presented to you, so regulation, carbon tax, cap and trade, and subsidies, we just wanted to give you a sense of what actually works in reality. And I thought this paper that was published in 2024 is a very nice summary of it. So they conducted an ex post analysis on the policies that were effectively implemented around the globe from 1998 to 2022, and they assessed the policies that actually worked, and they measured that, and they did that for different sectors and different kind of policies that are somewhere in the graph on the top right. And they came out with this Climate Policy Explorer, which is a website where you can browse whether you want to take a look at your country and see what policies that have been implemented had actually worked, or you can take a look at what kind of policies performed the best among those that have been tested the past 20 years, and for which economic sector. So just to give you a glimpse, in the US, and you look at the transport sector, you can see that between 2005 and 2010, there's been a bunch of regulation and subsidy policies that came out on the transport sector. So essentially, performance standard for the fuels, like for example, ensuring that the carbon content of the fuels match a certain level, so the amount of CO2 emissions resulting from their combustion decreases. And so they came out with, for each specific country, sector and policy, they came out with this estimation, which is the red line, and it's the estimation of how would emissions have continued if there were no policies implemented, and what has been observed. So what has been observed is the dark and blue line is a model estimation of these emissions to confirm that what has been observed is could have been anticipated by the policies. So they give this estimation of how much were emissions reduced, and it's for in this example about 8%. So again, just to give you an example of how policies can be appreciated, and if you want to take a look at your country in a specific sector, you can visit this Climate Policy Explorer. online.
Thank you. Okay. So as a next step, we're going to give some examples from around the world of specific policies that have been included. I'm going to go through an example of New Zealand, and then Lucas will go through things like Europe. So the reason why I focus on New Zealand is, even though it's a very small country, it is renowned for having very, very good climate change policies. In recent years, they've sort of become less exceptional, but you know, they're still way ahead of the curve in terms of what they're attempting to do. And the key thing that sits behind this is they've got their Zero Carbon Amendment Act, or the Climate Change Response Amendment Act, which was introduced in 2019. And the idea was to provide a framework where New Zealand can develop and implement a clear and stable climate change policy. And they want to reach their Paris Agreement NDC and prevent temperature rise above 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and also to allow New Zealand to prepare for and adapt to the effects of climate change. So it's a pretty broad-reaching policy. And the idea here is to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Okay, so they set a target for two sort of key areas of greenhouse gas emissions. So the net emissions of all greenhouse gases are to be net zero by 2050. And then they add in specifically a reduction of biogenic methane to 24 to 47% below 2017 levels by 2050 and 10% below this by 2030. Okay? And the reason why New Zealand has this stipulation is because they're in a unique situation that 48% of their emissions come from livestock. So that's cows and sheep basically burping and farting methane. And within this act, the New Zealand government recognises that their main policy tool is the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme. And this is essentially a cap and trade program that has been in place for quite a long time. And it acts like a tax in the way that I explained. You have permits that these individuals trade with each other to get a price to. And it's to charge individuals and companies for their pollution and to get rid of that negative externality that comes from polluting. And so, as I said before, these emissions trading schemes, or the cap and trade schemes, work by the government setting pollution units or permits that are then reduced over time to reach a target, and as they're reduced over time, the cost of them goes up. Okay, so the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme has quite a long history. It was set up in 2008 as part of the original Kyoto Protocol, and it was linked with a global market. Okay, it was then that was then all closed in, I think, 2015. It could have been a bit earlier than that, when that global market collapsed, and they decided to keep it just as a domestic emissions trading scheme, and the price has bit much more since they've done that. Okay, and the idea is it requires businesses to measure and report their greenhouse gas emissions, because if you don't get them to do that, you have no idea what they're actually emitting. And it requires businesses to surrender one permit or unit to the government for every tonne of emissions that they produce, and then they limit the number of units or permits available to businesses year by year. And an important sort of note to include, the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme is the only emissions trading scheme around the world to include forestry carbon sequestration as part of the market. So that means that they pay farmers for keeping trees in the ground and absorbing carbon. So you instantly have an incentive there, and as the price goes up, the incentive to do that increases more. Okay, so it covers quite a lot of emissions. So you've got carbon dioxide as one, methane as another, you've got nitrous oxide, you have hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorochemicals, I think they are, and then sulfur hexafluoride. All of these are covered in the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme. So it's all the sort of key emissions that you think of. As I said before, it used to be internationally linked, but it's now domestically, it's only domestic, sorry, and there's a sort of limit in the number of sectors currently included. So it includes forestry, and that's the emissions from burning fuel from tractors and things, but also forestry in terms of paying farmers for keeping trees in the ground. You've got stationary energy, which is just electricity and heat. You've got transport, you've got industrial processes, synthetic greenhouse gases, which are from a combination of different processes, and you have waste as well, and the main emissions from waste are things like methane. Now, something important to note here is that biogenic methanes are excluded from the New Zealand emissions trading scheme, and it was meant to be until 2025, but they negated on that last year, and it looks unlikely that biogenic emissions are going to be included in any sort of New Zealand emissions trading scheme. Okay, so that's a lot of background. To give you an idea of what's actually happening and the mechanisms that happen or occur within this trading scheme market, the key players are the government, the producers and the producers that remove emissions, and then the New Zealand economy. Okay, so the government comes in and they allocate units, and that's either for free or they have their own auction to different producers in New Zealand. Okay, and these producers are holding on to these permits, and for every tonne of emissions that they produce, they have to surrender a permit. Okay, so the permits that they were given or that they bought from the government in this initial auction might be able to cover the emissions that they've already going to produce for that year. So that's fine. Okay, but then you have some companies that are more efficient than others, and they produce not as much emissions as the permits that they were given, and they think, hey, we've got these extra permits. What are we going to do with them? You have other producers that are really inefficient, okay? They're producing more emissions than what they've been given, so they have to go to the market and purchase those units off other producers. And there's two ways they can do this. They can either directly interact with another producer and purchase those units in a private exchange, or they can enter the overall auction. Okay, and there's a big auction that happens where all of these producers with additional permits say, hey, you guys are welcome to buy them, and depending on the scarcity of those permits, there is a price that is set, and all those producers come away and say, okay, now we've got enough permits to produce. And then there's a third player in this, and they're producers who remove emissions. So if you plant a tree, you get given permits by the government, and those permits can then be sold at auction, and you can earn revenue from those trees each year as long as you keep those trees in the ground. Okay, so you have this big auction that happens, and you have a big exchange of value. There's revenue from the government auction that occurs, so that's the initial one that happens, and there's also revenue within the market. So some of that money goes directly to producers who have been more efficient. They get rewarded for being efficient, and there's incentive to continue being efficient. And then the government also has auction revenue from that initial transaction, and they feed that back into the New Zealand economy with the idea to give it to clean technologies as subsidies. So subsidies I talked about before. And the idea is as well, because you now have this additional price, things are going to get more expensive in the New Zealand economy. Okay? So it means the goods that are typically high emissions, or they have high emissions factors, now cost more, and so you'll have consumers changing their mind on which products they purchase, okay? Because they are going to go to the less costly versions of what they can. Now, these offset units, that is an idea for the future to try and sort of incorporate this market with the global market, but it's yet to be announced how they're going to do that. So it's a very good emissions trading scheme that New Zealand has. It's one of the most comprehensive in the world with regards to what's existing within a country. You have some regions that have more extensive emissions trading schemes, but it's not typically a full countrywide emissions trading scheme. It covers approximately 52% of the emissions from New Zealand, with 48% not covered because we're not looking at biogenic methane, and that is a problem that they need to solve in the future. There's currently no linkages to international markets, and this is a problem because this climate change is an international problem, okay? And as I said yesterday, you can get a bit of a free rider issue when you're looking at introducing a climate change policy because other countries are saying, well, they're doing a great job, we'll just jump on the back of what they're doing. And the problem is as well, the success of the New Zealand emissions trading scheme relies on politicians allowing it to operate. So quite often you get new governments coming in and they introduce subsidies to high emitting markets or high emitting producers, and that negates the cost that they would have to pay for the higher cost permits. So there's a lot of politics involved in this, and there's a lot of lobbying from high emitting industries in New Zealand, and it causes quite a lot of issues in terms of trying to get this emissions trading scheme to operate effectively. Another problem is it already adds to the increasing costs of living, and as we all know, those costs of living are going up and up. And so far, there's actually limited evidence of it reducing emissions in New Zealand. There was a period where they were starting to go down, but there was a change in government, and then they started to plateau and go back up. So it's a continuing problem, but it is a good example of how an emissions trading scheme as a framework can operate, and I think if the politicians let it do its thing, it will start to work in the future. Okay, I'll hand it over to Lucas now, and he'll talk about some other policies.
So I'm going to give you another example of an emission trading system, which is the European Union emission trading system. And it's the opportunity to go a little bit more into the details of how it works for what we call the primary market and the secondary market. So the primary market is when the government sets a cap on the emissions, which is represented in this graph by the dashed line. So it's saying in this virtual example where there's only 4 companies here. So it's saying that you are allowed to emit this amount of CO2 emissions, which is also accounted in allowances. An allowance can represent a ton of CO2, for example. And so each segment here represents a bid. So each company has bid it and say, okay, I'm ready to pay for my emissions for this price, and I'm expecting to emit this amount of CO2, so of allowances. And so once the auction's done, the market will clear at this intersection. So where you have the cap intersectioning the last bid made. So every company, every segment is going to pay for their allowances at this price. So there are some allowances that are given for free for some companies that are very burdened by their environmental context, like they are very trade exposed or energy intensive, so they are getting some free allowances. But companies, when they buy their allowances, they directly give the money to the European budgets. It also goes to the Innovation Fund and Modernization, so this money is reinvested. And then comes the secondary market. So if one of the 4 companies here have emitted less than they have expected, they can sell the permits they have in surplus to the other companies that actually have emitted more. So after these auctions, allowances can be either used by the firm, so they're allowed to emit into a certain level, or sold to the other firms that have emitted more than they were allowed to do. The EU ETS is more limited in terms of scope compared to the New Zealand one. It's only covering CO2 emissions from, from power generation and heat production, heavy industry, so essentially cement, steel, aviation, and maritime transports recently. So it's about 40% of emissions. So this is really not enough if we want to tackle the whole emissions problem. Every year companies covered by the system will report their emissions and hand in enough allowances to match them, and if they don't, they face a fine for emitting too much, and this fine can be very expensive, as of 100 euros per ton of CO2. In 2027, the second phase of the ETS will cover more sectors than listed here, including fuel distribution for road transport and buildings. Next slide. The main criticisms for this system is that there is price volatility. So on this graph, it's shown the historical price evolution since the introduction of the ETS in 2005. You can see that, oh, sorry, I really don't master this. Come on. Yeah, so you can see that the prices are very unstable here, and companies don't like it. They want to have a clear signal on what they will have to pay in the future and now. And you can also see a problem that is clearly identifiable here during the subprime crisis, and what happens is what is called over-allocation. Because at this period, the companies didn't realize that there is going to be a subprime crisis, so they didn't anticipate that. So they have paid for a lot of allocations, but since they produces much less than they were expecting, they had a bunch of allowances that they didn't use, and so consequently the price fell down to zero because the market saturated. Recently, as Europe is strengthening its policies, its ambitions, the price has gone as almost 100 per ton of CO2. Another criticism that I have mentioned before is that it's limited coverage, only 40% of emissions. And so to stabilize this volatility in price, right after the subprime crisis was introduced the Market Stability Reserve, which is a complex mechanism to prevent large surplus or shortage allowances if there's a crisis or whatever, and it makes the ETS more robust to economic shocks. And I'm gonna skip that. And the other important mechanism the EU is gonna deploy this year is the CBAM, so Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So the principle is to put a carbon price on import of certain goods entering the EU. So basically the same sectors are targeted. And so this carbon price has to reflect the CO2 emissions embedded in their production. So for example, if the price the price set by the emission trading system is 90 euros, and you have a company, let's say in China, that produces 90 euros another price is just the price to produce a specific good. But if a non-EU company produces this good for much less, it has to pay for the difference in terms of ton of CO2. So there happens the carbon border adjustment. So it's basically to avoid leakage, so that companies that face a big carbon climate policy cost within the EU don't go abroad and produce and run their business abroad. It's then to maintain EU companies' competitivity and steer global carbon incentives. So this mechanism is only set up if the country where a company imports goods from doesn't have an ETS or a similar mechanism. So it's to steer global incentive. The first phase just terminated this year. So it was just a reporting phase where EU importers must report the emissions in their imported goods quarterly without financial penalties. So it was a preparing phase. And the second phase, which just entered this January, the importers must buy and surrender CBAM certificates for the embedded emissions with the cost based on the ETS. And this is an estimation of what could what it could raise in terms of money. An estimation by country and by sectors. So according to this, the U.S. Climate Leadership Council, the EU can expect this cumulative amount of revenues from other countries to have, to be collected and reinvested in Europe. It's criticized currently for being very complex administratively, especially because you cannot really control and have control or verify how foreign companies emit CO2 and how much they emit it. It's also, so it's basically a trade policy, so which we all know now that it's very risky. And it can also impact developing countries that don't necessarily have enough resources to steer or to develop an ETS in their border, and also to decarbonize quite cost efficiently. And with that, I think we are good for questions.
And I'll quickly just add, if anyone needs to go early, please come back tomorrow. We have a really cool sort of couple of activities planned. So the first is we're going to play a nutrient trading game where it gives you an idea of what an emissions trading scheme how it works in real life, just through individual farms, and you'll all act and make decisions. And then we have a really cool expert panel where you can ask people from a range of different industries questions on the things we've talked about, or something else you're interested in relation to climate change. But feel free to ask questions now about what we've just talked about.
So you had mentioned for the EU emissions trading scheme that there is like a fine or a fee as a consequence for going over. I don't think we covered what kind of enforcement looks like in the New Zealand context. Could you speak a little bit about that? And I would be curious to hear from both of you about like the efficacy of the enforcement mechanisms in each case.
So it might have changed, but I believe the New Zealand one works by essentially charging above the market price for permits whatever additional tonne of CO2 that they release. So it's essentially like a fine based on the amount of CO2 that they release above their permits. But because reporting is so carefully enforced, it's actually quite rare that companies go above their permit levels. I think that's something that New Zealand kind of nailed, and it does help being quite a small economy. You can sort of keep track of what's going on. And sorry, what was the second part of your question?
I was just curious to hear about like limitations in enforcement.
Yeah. I think the key limitations actually come more from things like when you have small industries entering the market and they then have to be involved with the emissions trading scheme, it gets difficult to work out actually what their emissions are, and if you base those emissions on what their production level is or some sort of historical number, because obviously companies are changing over time. So it becomes quite difficult to enforce sort of what actual companies are reporting. And then when you get into things like including forestry in the emissions trading scheme, it's quite easy for farmers to say, okay, we've planted this many hectares of land, please give me this money for the carbon that's been sequestered. For the government to actually check that is really, really costly. So the way that they get around that is they have these carbon tables that they provide for small land forestry, and so they essentially get a generic amount of money for the carbon that gets sequestered from those trees. And then the larger pieces of land, they use satellite imagery to try and make sure. So it's much more of a reporting thing, but I don't know if you can talk to the EU.
Well, in terms of limitations, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I think I've listed it, but it's a burden on companies, especially for small companies. When you have to report your emissions, you have to. It's an administrative cost that you have to ensure to respect the rules, which I think is more true for New Zealand the EU might have bigger companies, and also because the scope are usually heavy industries, and so big companies that most probably can afford for this cost. But yeah, in terms of limitations of the system, what really is critical is the 40% on CO2 on the scope, and it has to be broadened. Or if it's not broadened, other policies must occur on the other uncovered sectors.
What sort of incentives are in place for firms to not just pass these additional costs from the trading schemes right onto their consumers? Like, why doesn't it just everything get more expensive for the consumer and the firm doesn't have any cost to pay?
It essentially does.
Okay.
But what limits the amount that happens is the elasticity of demand you have in different markets. So if you think of something like petrol, then the producers can pass all of their costs onto the consumers, because as a consumer you don't have a lot of alternatives to filling your car up, right? But if you have an industry where there are lots of alternatives, it's a bit more difficult to pass those costs on. But essentially most of the costs get passed on because a lot of the high emissions sectors are quite inelastic. Yeah. Oh, there's a question there.
There's a question here.
I'm curious, for the permits, are they all, like for different industries, are they all the same price? Like, or is it like, oh, like they're probably trying to eliminate that kind of industry, or like will they charge them higher? And like if they trade, then would that affect the trading? Because I'm just not sure, because like carbon emissions and like, what if like, you know, like electric cars and you have the battery, but then the battery, when you dump it, like that also creates I don't know, like embodied, I don't know what I'm talking about, like embodied carbon or whatever. Like, does that do, I don't know, like things other than just carbon emissions play into how they like issue the permit, or like the price of the permit?
That's a really great question. So the price of the permits currently in the New Zealand emissions trading scheme are exactly the same for everything. And it's just from the source of emissions. They don't really think too much about embodied carbon and, you know, what happens to the battery over a life cycle, and it is an issue with that policy. But it's an issue with any policy if you think about, you know, how far down the line are you actually charging people for these emissions? You know, you've got a full life cycle of emissions when you're purchasing certain goods. There was a problem that they had back when it was linked internationally. They had a different price for domestic permits compared to international permits. That's part of the reason why that whole scheme broke apart. And the idea behind the permit is it's meant to represent the exact same thing between different firms. So it's meant to represent a ton of greenhouse gas emissions, and it doesn't matter where those greenhouse gas emissions come from, you're going to pay the same price regardless. And yeah, that's sort of the idea.
And so in the EU ETS, some heavy industries do get free allowances, so a permit to emit, because the government recognizes that it's much more difficult and costly to mitigate some emissions coming from hard to abate processes.
And one other point on that, just to put a plug for our panel tomorrow, one of our panelists, Jeremy Gregory, does a lot of research on life cycle analysis and its impact on climate. So yeah, bring those questions tomorrow.
Actually, piggybacking on that question is that New Zealand import a lot of manufacturing goods, right? Mm-hmm. So how do they deal with that? Because
it's a great question. They currently don't, essentially. They're only focused on emissions from production within their country, because that's what they have to report to the IPCC. So that is an issue with how the sort of Paris Agreement is set up, I suppose. But it's all about, they're thinking about introducing a similar CBAM so carbon border adjustment, and that is what the EU is trying to solve with the carbon border adjustment, is to reduce emissions coming in, but New Zealand's currently not worried about that. And I think part of it is they do import so much manufacturing goods that it would be quite an administrative nightmare, but I agree with you, it is a problem, yeah. Okay, great. Well, I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow, and thank you very much for coming to our presentations.